Well, hello and welcome to this week's episode of Political State from the Oklahoman. I'm Ben Felder. Joining me this morning as we record in the Oklahoman studios is my co-host Justin Wingerter. Justin, how's it going?
Good. It's a little earlier than we usually record. We're about 8:30 this morning.
Well, it's early because it's also a week earlier than we normally record.
That too.
Well, so listeners who have listened to our previous episode will notice the conversation with Senate Pro Tem Greg Treat that was recorded a week earlier. I say that because since we had that conversation with him, the Senate announced their legislative agenda, and so some of those details aren't in that conversation. This week we're recording again a week early. Normally we record on the day that we post, but recording a week early this week. And I say that to say that when you listen to this, there will have been the state of the state. The legislature will have officially kicked off its session. So we're not talking about that in this episode, but I think there probably will be a special podcast either on Monday or sometime around that to kind of debrief what the legislature is doing. So not talking about the state today, but we are talking about city politics. And that brings us to our guest here in this first segment, and that is Councilman Ed Shadid. Councilman, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
So, Councilman, 2011, you were first elected to the city council. 2 terms, 8 years in office. Was a run for mayor during that time. You are retiring from the council, so it's an open seat. There's an election, and we can talk about that here in a minute. But you were stepping away, and when I think about your time on council, I think of you. Every council member brings their own unique perspective and their voice. But during your 8 years, you maybe had the most unique voice, and I don't mean that. I mean that as kind of a compliment. In terms of just the perspective you brought, there were probably a lot of you were probably the lone vote on a lot of issues at times, and not always. But so let me say that first off, do you think that's a fair assessment? And then if so, what did you feel like your voice was? What was your role on this council? Because you put a spotlight on a lot of issues that, if it wasn't for you, maybe there wasn't going to be a spotlight on it.
Well, I guess that's the most important thing, both for me and for anybody who wants to be a public servant and who wants to run for office and be an elected official is, number one, to ask questions. Just don't assume that everything is correct, or that opinions that people are giving you, whether it's legal or political or necessarily, even if there's ingrained over time. We have to challenge all those assumptions, and that's how we make progress. I think that Oklahoma City, we're kind of known for being polite, if you will, but it's also kind of our passivity. And I think as Sam Anderson kind of wrote about this in the New York Times, is that it's a double-edged sword. I mean, it's very pleasant in our day-to-day interactions with each other, but maybe the populace is not questioning, as much as they should. And certainly I feel like our elected officials are not. I don't think that I haven't found the city council to be particularly intellectually curious, if you will.
Unpack that a little bit. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think we're insulated. I think a lot of what I learned was going out into the country, going to national meetings, trying to learn what other cities are doing. And I think there's a danger in constantly hiring everybody within Oklahoma City. Maybe not reaching out, not having department heads, not having elected officials and city councilors reach out to other cities and look what's happening in other cities to try and learn from their experiences. And I'll give you an example, is the streetcar, right? If other cities have gone ahead of you, then you need to go out and kind of learn what was there from their successes and their failures. I think, to this day, I don't think that the council and a lot of I don't think people understand the primary purpose of the streetcar, which is not necessarily a public transit vehicle, but a real estate economic development tool. And so you have all these cities coming together, and they're lobbying Washington, and they all understand this, and they're speaking at meetings like Railvolution, which moves to a different city each year, that a streetcar is primarily a real estate development tool. So like in Portland, you would put the streetcar in an area where there is no development, and you would partner with a large developer, and the city would get something that otherwise couldn't happen. So you'd get this developer to have a large affordable housing component, right? And then you'd bring the streetcar there, and then you all partner together. And that's its primary purpose in Portland. And the director of the Portland streetcar who came and consulted here will advocate for that. But we had meetings in the beginning where they were saying, well, we should delay the streetcar because it doesn't have the economic impact. I think there was a figure of like $17,000 was the expected economic impact of the streetcar. It was just preposterous. And so I give that as just one example of I don't feel like we're looking at what peer cities are doing. I think we're insulated, and we don't ask questions as much. And I think I consider that my most important duty.
When you're the only one asking the question, sometimes it can come across like you're.
But Ben, it only takes one.
Yeah,
and that's what's so important. Is that yes, there's a supermajority on the council. I don't feel like the council represents the demographics or the political orientation of the city. It's overwhelmingly Caucasian, it's overwhelmingly male, it's overwhelmingly Republican, and all that's fine if it's, but not when it's like 8 out of 9 people, 7 out of 9 people, and so you have a certain political bent, you have a certain allegiance to certain socioeconomic and political forces in the city. But it only takes one person to ask those questions, and then the question gets out there. It doesn't matter if it's only 1 out of 9 people or 2 out of 9 people. It doesn't matter if you're on the short end of 8-1 votes over and over and over. If you can get the question out there and get the facts out there, you've done a great service. So those who may be intimidated that I don't want to run for council, I'm going to be on the short end of You can do a great service by just asking the questions and getting it out there. I think that I'll give you one example. When I first got on there was a real estate deal with the Vitagraph property. And the city was we allowed someone to, what we knew was a preposterous real estate value for the transaction. We knew that they were going to, it was basically tax fraud, is basically what it was. But I asked the questions and brought that out, right? To me, it was like when I first got on there, that was just accepted. It was just, well, that's his, if he wants to claim a wildly embellished value for this land on his taxes, that's his business. But by bringing it out there, and then I ended up, having an alliance with Pete White. He was a great mentor and an ally on a lot of these things. We never saw things like that again. And I think that, to me, it might be that asking questions, the biggest impact might be the things that you don't ever see, because people know that there's if this real estate deal, if it's too questionable, it might get called out at council, whereas I'm not sure it would have before.
Yeah. When I think about your time in office, and I think about some of the issues that you advocated for, I see a lot of those issues now, more mainstream, and
right.
Whether some may say give you credit for it, or some may say you're just kind of speaking for that community that already existed. But questioning the role of maps and whether or not there should be more investment in the neighborhoods. I mean, that was kind of you go back several years ago, and that was kind of a far-fetched idea for some to say, well, this is for big projects downtown. What do you mean do something outside? Now that's a major part of the conversation right now. I think about, when you ran for mayor, one of your big issues, if I'm remembering right, was, diversity in these boards and commissions.
Right.
We reported last year in the numbers, and you were talking about this 4 years ago.
You did a great job, yeah.
That they don't reflect the city. Well, now that's a constant conversation with our new mayor and others. And so,
right.
Do you feel like a lot of the things that you were trying to bring attention to, are they more kind of in the mainstream conversation, 8 years, later after you were elected?
Absolutely. I mean, I feel like, again, the most important thing for me was to go out to national conferences like the Congress for New Urbanism and kind of see what was going on in other cities. And it became very clear that things like walkability and protecting the pedestrian and public transit and all these things were other cities were ahead of us. So I think that's where I learned it. I think that, yes, it was when I first got on the council, we weren't having the same conversations, but Oklahoma City is having a parallel track to a lot of urban centers throughout the country. And we can learn from other cities. But yeah, a lot of these things came into more mainstream. Now, do I think that, we've talked about it, and you did a great job in that article. We still don't have the diversity on the council. We still don't have the diversity on boards and commissions, but people are at least aware, and that's the first step. We're aware that this is a difficult city for pedestrians. We're aware, I think one of the most tragic and I guess if I have the most sadness about anything is that we do have a city that's 620 square miles where you really are automobile dependent, or a lot of the populace is, but you have 23% of the people in Oklahoma City that are living below the poverty line, right? And it takes $10,000 to own, operate, maintain a vehicle. It's outside the financial abilities of a lot of people. 23%, same number as Michael Jordan and LeBron James, right? 23% of the people living in Oklahoma City live below the poverty line. So how is it that we were the largest city in America until basically right now without any public transit on Sundays or in the evenings? It's really, I have a lot of sadness about that. I mean, it's one of the most sadistic things I think I've been a part of, is that we didn't provide transit on Sundays. I mean, it's just incredible. The largest city in America not to do that. And honestly, I'm not sure if we didn't have the streetcar and there weren't concerns about like a Title VI violation, that you're treating one socioeconomic class and general race, which is wealthy Caucasians riding the streetcar, differently than, minority populations that are, many of which are impoverished. You're treating them differently on the bus. You're asking for a Title VI lawsuit. That happened in Los Angeles, that happened in Atlanta, and they got to do their transit planning in the courts for a decade. This is probably the largest discrepancy of level of service between different modes of public transit in the country. Between what we do for our bus, where we have people sitting on 40-year-old 2x4s that are, with no protection from the Oklahoma City cold or winters or heat in the summer. And you just have them sitting out there, whereas in our streetcar we have beautiful, stops protecting them from the elements, and 15-minute frequencies as opposed to coming every hour, which we've done most of my time here. I mean, it's a wildly discrepant level of service, and those kind of things are just inching into the public discourse, and maybe the city councils, and maybe the thought of like a Title VI challenge maybe is pushing people along. But yeah, these are things that Pete White and I were talking about 8 years, and now when you finally have the streetcar, and it's like, well, of course we have to have Sunday service for the streetcar, and then you hopefully people take the next step and think, well, if we have to have Sunday service for the streetcar, I mean, why wouldn't we have buses on Sunday? I mean, there's a lot of people that are completely dependent on the bus to get food or to get to a job or get to, to survive. And so hopefully that those things come in more into the mainstream and more into the public discourse and the city council's discourse.
What would you like to see next on transit?
On transit?
Yeah.
Well, I think you've got to have a dedicated funding source. I mean, I think any city that has a 1/8 cent dedicated funding source for the zoo and a huge dedicated funding source for tourism, and the hotel motel tax all goes to the state fairgrounds or the Chamber of Commerce for tourism. I mean, we have these dedicated funding sources for all these things, but we don't have it for transit. And so, I'd like to see equilibration of level of service between the streetcar and the buses. If it's important to make it that the traffic signals change as the streetcar's coming, signal prioritization to make it, make there be a preference for public transit, do the same thing for buses. If it's important to protect streetcar riders from the elements and the harsh Oklahoma City weather, do the same thing for buses. Make it, if there's apps that tell you in real time when the streetcar's arriving, do the same thing for the buses. I mean, just equilibrate level of service. That's where we're so wildly an outlier compared to other urban centers in America. We just don't have this wildly discrepant level of service. So that's I think, equilibrate level of service, try and increase frequency, get a dedicated funding source for transit.
Is it fair to say you had expand buses before you expanded the streetcar?
Absolutely. I mean, I still don't think that people understand the purpose of a streetcar. And we're talking about expanding streetcar in Maps 4 a few months from now, and I honestly don't think people understand it. It's a real estate development tool. It's not primarily a public transit vehicle. So if the Alliance for Economic Development or somebody had a large development, they had a partnership with a developer and they wanted to go to a certain area, and they said, look, we can tackle your affordable housing program that if you look out to urban centers throughout America, is coming when you put this massive kind of investment in one small area downtown. You're going to get gentrification. You're going to get affordable housing problems because all these other places have. The revitalization of downtown, it's not unique to Oklahoma City, right? It's happening in urban centers throughout America. Mm-hmm. And so you can learn where that downtown revitalization is even more robust and a few years ahead of us. You can learn from other cities and you can try and adapt. Well, the streetcar is primarily a real estate development tool, and so you can maybe tackle some of that gentrification or tackle some of those affordable housing issues. But you don't just blindly do it without partnerships, without a plan of how you're going to develop the area, and have it be primarily a public transit vehicle. So if the concern is public transit, invest in public transit. And our bus system needs investment, it needs attention, and I think that's our highest priority right now.
Yeah, I think I'm sure this is not unique. I mean, I know it's not unique to Oklahoma City. Maybe it's highlighted again. You referenced, the New York Times writer Sam Anderson in his book that came out last year, and I thought, one of the good things about the book that he put a spotlight on, and others have, is that Oklahoma City in the 90s was in such a state that felt like it was so behind other cities that it just had to, it wanted to check off the boxes. We need that arena, we need the new library, the art museum, all these things.
Right.
We want to be, for lack of a better phrase, cool. And in and of itself, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. You want to be a vibrant, a lively city. But it seems like it did kind of create this environment where to be critical of some of those elements was to be critical of the overall effort.
Right.
I remember when you ran for mayor, and I won't say the individual, but someone told me, because I don't know that it was an on-the-record conversation, but I asked him about your chances, and this was someone who was kind of in the chamber crowd. It said, well, he'll get at least 30% of the vote because at least 30% of people are against everything. And I thought that was interesting.
Right.
This idea that to question some of these things makes you against what we're trying to do.
Right.
Is that still the case today? And I don't know if it is quite as much, because like we talked about earlier, this conversation has changed. The things you were talking about 8 years ago that looked like made you an outlier are now kind of being embraced, maybe not as a whole, but by more people. How did the conversation change? How did you personally try to change it for yourself and not just become the member of the council who was against everything as some saw it, to bring a credible voice to important issues that maybe have been neglected?
I think it was by reaching out and seeing what was happening in other cities and kind of being okay with knowing that this is going to come here, just because we're not that unique. I mean, this is happening in all urban centers. It's going to come to Oklahoma City eventually. And so just being okay with that, and just being okay with, asking questions, knowing that this is coming. Now, I would still say that we've got this issue with maps where it kind of has its own, force and its own label, and it's like if you question maps, if you want to try and make maps better, that somehow you're against progress and against. And we like to build things, right? We like to build, and it's nice to see like big projects and big capital projects, but I think what's harder to see is that, and I would hope that people would realize this as we enter a new maps discussion, is that there's a cost on the operations side. And it's not sexy to talk about operations. It's not, you can't see it. You can't necessarily, it's so incremental, and it's just, you can't feel it all at once, like when you see a new park being built or a new convention center going up with this, so with the cranes and things. So, but there is a cost. We're the only state in America that doesn't allow cities to use property tax for its operations, right? So we're an outlier there. 49 states are over here, and Oklahoma's by itself over here. So we're very, very dependent on sales tax for operations. So if you look at the major cities, the biggest cities in Oklahoma, Tulsa, Lawton, our sales tax rate that we use for operations has been artificially low. It's been lower as a percentage than those other cities. And the reason is to be able to have room for a 1 cent sales tax for maps, right? Well, there's a cost to that. The cost is you don't have money to have Sunday bus service because your public transit department doesn't have enough money. You don't have money to maintain your parks. And so you've got studies showing Oklahoma City is way behind other urban centers in maintaining and investing in its parks. You had issues with having enough police officers or having enough fire for years. So those kind of things are below the surface, and it's much, much harder in the conversation to explain that in 30 seconds. There's no sexy soundbite that you can use to explain that, but there's a cost to all of us of artificially keeping our sales tax low so that we can put sales tax into capital. Because remember, we have a vehicle to build things, and that's our property tax. We have bonds, right? So everything that's in maps, convention center, downtown park, all these things, you could build that with your bonds. You don't need maps to do that. Whereas sales tax is, you have to have that for operations. That's all you have for operations. And so that's, I guess if there's something that I would hope that comes into the mainstream discourse is, are we investing enough in maintaining and operating these things? One problem with MAPS 3 was that you built a lot of things and you had no plan whatsoever for how to pay for the operations. You put $130 million into a streetcar. Well, how are you going to pay for the $4 million a year to run it? We didn't have a plan. You're going to build a $100 million downtown park. Well, how are you going to pay for the $4 million a year to operate and maintain it? No plan, right? So do you take money from neighborhood parks from your park budget to now address this huge 70-acre park downtown? If you're going to build big things, big capital investments, you've got to have a plan for how to pay for the operations and maintenance going forward. Because $4 million a year, that's $40 million a decade. And you've got to have a plan, or you're going to be diverting from other neighborhood resources to pay for those projects.
Yeah. Well, in the couple minutes we have left in this first segment, I want to ask you, what's the future like for you? I mean, I know you've got a medical practice and and a business and a family, but what's any political future you feel like moving forward? Or
I'm a big believer in the initiative petition process. I think it's just democracy at its most pure, its most beautiful. And I'd like to explore, how maybe that can be done at the local level, at the municipal level.
To be involved in that process?
Yes, be involved in that process. I think that a lot of things, in my 8 years, we've had a lot of issues where you'd have 30, 40, 50 people come to the council advocating for something like urban chickens, or you could say urban hens if that's easier to digest. And nobody opposed. And the council, 2-3 times votes against it. We talk about food deserts, and since I got here, the whole 8 years and years before, we've talked about trying to get a grocery store on the northeast side, and we can't get it done. But we deprive people of the right to have a food source in their backyard, which is being done in urban centers throughout America. And people have asked for it en masse, but the council won't give it to them. And we have chickens throughout the city already, just people are violating the law. But the council won't give it to them. So let people, petition their government. That is the Oklahoma Supreme Court considers that a sacred right. They use the word sacred. Let people petition and just have a vote of the people directly. One other issue I'll just bring up in our last, you cannot pay the council and mayor, I believe, what we're currently paying. And maybe you brought this up, or the pay of public officials, and I think people were taken aback by what we pay the mayor. You can't pay the council $12,000, the mayor $24,000. That's, if you're doing this right and you're spending 40 hours a week, that's like $6 an hour for the council, $12 for the mayor. You're asking for trouble corruption-wise. It's a penny wise, pound foolish, dollar foolish. You're asking for trouble. You're restricting the number of people who can serve on council. And I think that this December, if you're going to have a citywide vote for maps, that would be the time to do initiative petitions. That would be a time if people get together and think, well, we'd like to have a vote of the people, it would be this December. You need to have a citywide election, so if it's not this December, it might be 2 or 3 years before you could do it again. But people might think about that. What is it that you'd like to see come to a vote of the people directly? And these are the kind of things that I think to raise the salary of the council would require a vote of the people. So I give that as an example of something that we might think about. But I do think that on my time in 8 years, corruption has been a problem at council. I think the council desperately needs an ethics commission. Virtually every city, large city our size, has an ethics commission where you have an independent third party that looks at charter violations or of the council and these boards of commissions you were referencing. In Oklahoma City, we have the council kind of policing itself, and I can tell you it's not working. We have a corruption issue. We need an ethics commission. We need an independent third party. You can't be asking the city attorney or the city auditor, if your behavior's okay, when those people owe you their job. So I give that as maybe a final example of something we might think about this year.
Yeah. So no longer in elective office. It sounds like you're going to still be busy in a lot of when it comes to local issues and local politics. So, well, Councilman Shadid, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben.
Congrats on your career in the council, and good luck as you kind of go through the final few months. And we look forward to speaking to you again down the road.
Thank you. Thank you both.
We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in just a moment for the second half of Political State. All right, welcome back to Political State from the Oklahoman. I'm Ben Felder, along with Justin Wingerter, our guest in the first half of the episode, or first segment of the episode, Councilman Ed Shadid, who is entering the end of his second and final term on the city council. And Justin, so said at the top of the episode, we're recording this the final day of January. It's going to drop a week later. So by the time that our listeners are hearing this, they have probably already heard and had a chance to cope with the fact that you will no longer be at the Oklahoman, and more importantly, you will no longer be on the Political State podcast. In fact, today, January 31st, right? It's the 31st.
Yes.
Is your final day at the paper.
It is, yeah. I am moving on to the Denver Post next month. It'll take a few weeks to travel, and then start with the Post next month. It's been a lot of fun, really, to be part of the show. Thank you. I mean, to all the readers, to all the listeners, to everyone who wrote to me, who had a dialogue about politics or a dialogue about journalism, a dialogue about the city and the state that they care so much about, and our role as journalists in that. And it's been a great privilege, a great honor, and a lot of fun to talk politics, Oklahoma politics, the last about 2 years.
Yeah, and it's hard to believe that it's only been 2 years. I mean, I think it would be hard to find many, reporters here or anywhere else that has crammed as much in 2 years as you have. And I mean, obviously, it's a big election year last year that you had a chance to cover. I thought you brought a lot of great context to federal government issues, and not an easy beat, because you followed in the path of our former federal government reporter who was based in D.C. for a few decades, Chris Castile. So not easy to follow a veteran like that. Chris is now our boss as the news director.
Yes, yeah.
So not easy to have your boss be the person who did your job and knows exactly how he'd like it to be. But I know you've got a big fan in Chris and a big fan in many of us. And I'm curious to you, at the end of the year, we did kind of what were the biggest stories of the year. So I'm not saying the most impactful stories per se, but what were some of your favorite stories that you had a chance to cover here?
There are several. Let me say, first of all, that I'm a big fan of Chris, and he's been very helpful. And this is something you're seeing, just a little journalism note, is you have very few papers that have a D.C. bureau now.
Yeah.
So you have federal government reporters based in the city that they're covering. And that is that's something I've done in a couple of states, and we'll do in one more in Colorado at least. And it's been interesting, and I think it puts you there with the readers, though, a little more. You don't get caught in the D.C. stuff, for lack of a better term. And it's not to say you can't do really good reporting in D.C. Obviously, there are a lot of benefits to being there in the Capitol, but there are also some benefits to being here. As far as my favorite stories or better stories, there were some interesting ones, as you point out. It was an interesting election year, and I was just talking the other day with a Kendra Horn aide or former campaign aide about a coffee we had at Clarity Coffee, in the summer of 17, when he just swore over and over again that he had a candidate who could beat Steve Russell in 2018. And I was, I think, rightly skeptical at the time. And I was skeptical up until about 5 minutes before the last returns came in on election night. And I think I had right to be, but he was very adamant that he had this candidate, Kendra Horn, who could do something a Democrat had not done in 44 years here in Oklahoma City in the 5th District. And she did, of course. And watching that rise, watching a candidate sort of come into existence and then morph with the constituency or the electorate around her, and how that shaped her, how she shaped the dialogue. And of course, that election was a bit of a wild one the last few weeks before the election. And so that was an interesting one. There were any number of interesting stories involving the delegation. Wrote once about the Mueller investigation, a few times, mostly getting reactions to things. But in one case, actually digging through the documents dug up by the Mueller investigation into Paul Manafort, and actually an effort to kill a resolution that Jim Inhofe had put together last decade, I believe it was. And that was really interesting to watch and to dig through those documents. And I don't know if that story got the attention that I kind of thought it was going to at the time, but it was a rather interesting one. Certainly, anytime you have a chance to dig through, this international intrigue and the Senate intrigue into what was basically just a harmless resolution that didn't have any real effect. It was just a sense of the Senate that they were disapproving of the current dictator. But the dictator of Ukraine at the time had a real effort to kill it, and he enlisted Paul Manafort and a number of others who we now know a great deal about their backdoor dealing. So that was an interesting one. That one stands out. Any number of investigative pieces, environmental reporting, which was something
a lot on that.
That was something I'd not done and didn't really plan to do. It was just, unfortunately, there were a lot of stories to be told here in Oklahoma regarding contamination and that sort of those sort of environmental problems, and they just kept coming up. And I did a number of those stories; those stand out. But and mostly it was just covering the issues of the day and trying to do it in the most responsible way and the way that informs our readers the most. And we had and we still do, such a great reader base that, would let me know when they thought I went a little this way or a little that way, but they would also come back and compliment me, and they would say some pretty rough things at times, but then they would come back the next week, and say, actually, I really like that story, and I thought you did a really good job on this, and and sometimes even apologize or something like that about previous comments. And that was, I just loved that dialogue that I had with readers, with listeners, and previously viewers of this podcast. Just a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, and it should be mentioned also that your departure also means the departure of your wife, Meg Wingerter.
It does,
who
yes.
in and of herself is a stellar reporter, someone I've had a chance to work with closely at times during your time here. Our healthcare reporter, who I think brings her own unique ability to bring clarity to a complicated subject. I'm sure you guys could probably do a podcast of your own just at your dinner table at night. I'm sure those conversations are pretty riveting. But yeah, so an end of a short era, but an era nonetheless. And it seems like just yesterday that you and Meg were here. I can remember. I think you came down. I remember the first time we had met. I think I had a chance to show you around a little bit. I think you were also given a tour by Steve Lackmeyer, which I think people pay for, so you got that for free. But yes, a lot of important work, and you're going to be sorely missed. But congrats on the new gig. I know you'll do a great job, and I look forward to being more plugged in with Colorado politics.
Thank you.
Continue to follow it. Well, I don't know on that note if there's anything else left to talk about, really. We were going to maybe debrief a little bit of the councilman's conversation. You had a story which will be last week from when this drops, on the Ward 6 council race to fill the open seat left by Meg Sawyer. I will have had a story when this podcast drops on the Ward 2 race to fill Shadid's open seat. So a lot of good city council coverage coming your way. And once again, this week was the start of the official legislative session, at least this week, meaning that when this episode drops. So check with newsok.com and probably this podcast feed, because I think we'll have some stuff in there. But you won't be with us, so this is it. Justin, good luck, bud. We're gonna miss you. The show and the paper will be is better for having you here, but we'll definitely be different with you leaving. So
well, thank you, and it was a good final guess. The never boring Ed Shadid there, not one to bite his tongue, let's say.
Yeah, well, and it's going to be interesting to see who replaces him specifically, but just the kind of voices. We have these few seats that are up for grabs, a couple open seats. There's going to be some new voices on the council.
Well, we just got Nikki Nice. The council just got Nikki Nice.
Yeah,
and
so
a new face there.
Yeah, and so I think, like I said, I think it's accurate to say that Shadid was from day one talking about a lot of issues that now are kind of more mainstream, and whether or not you want to give him credit for it or just say that he was reflective of kind of the changing demographics of the city or the changing attentions of the city, whether you're a fan or a critic of Shadid, he definitely had an impact in the council. And squeezed a lot into his 8 years. That's going to do it for this week's episode of the Political State Podcast. You can find each and every episode in your favorite podcasting feed or app. You can also find us on the Oklahoman's YouTube page. With Justin, I'm Ben. We'll see you again next week.